Our first pro revenge story is from PJ Murphy. Not going to pay overtime? Think again. TL. Dicta don't mess with the IT guy. I was discussing this sub with a good friend, and he said, "Boy, have I got a story that'll fit." It wasn't his story, but his brother's, and I sat with him and got the details. Buckle up, it's a good one. And a long one. Let's call him Bob. Bob has been fiddling with computers since he was a kid and knows them pretty well. As with most IT people, he's moved from job to job. The employer he worked for was a service/distribution company, and there were two IT employees. The company was located in Ontario, Canada. About 3 years ago, Bob's employer decided to modernize their software. They had separate programs for dispatching, for inventory, for payroll and finances, and it was complicated moving information from one program to the other. They decided to get an ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning program, and Bob recommended one that he knew inside out from a previous employer. For those of you who don't know, an ERP program handles everything: purchase orders, sales, inventory, personnel, vendors, customers, and all of it. You can run a report and find out which customer has bought the most Part ABC in the last year, which salesman has improved his numbers the most, which vendor has the fastest delivery time, which shipper packed the most orders. Everyone in the company used the ERP program, but it was very complicated, and they used the aspects of it that related to their position. For example, the receiver would accept a shipment, verify the quantity, confirm it was received, and the inventory stats would be available to the salespeople if they wanted to look up how many were on hand. The receiver didn't care what the price was or who the vendor was, he just did his job. Bob was run ragged during the implementation process, but he managed to train most of the employees on their aspects, and after a few months, everything was running fairly smoothly. Bob still got tickets for tweaks in the operation of the software and occasional hardware IT issues. Then the company decided to expand their footprint and was marketing into different time zones. That messed things up. Atlantic Canada is 90 minutes early, so if someone sent an email or an order at 8 a.m. their time, it would arrive at 6:30 a.m. Ontario time. Pacific Canada is 3 hours late, so an email sent at 3 p.m. Vancouver time would arrive at 6 p.m. This stretched out the day. So many staff came in early and worked late. Bob would arrive at 8 a.m., and there would be people that demanded his immediate assistance and were annoyed that he didn't respond instantly, even though their request was submitted before his start time. Same with late in the day. His phone would ring at dinner time with people that wanted help right now. They decided to stagger his and his IT colleagues' shift times. Bob would start at 6 a.m. and work till 2:30, and his colleague would start at 10:30 a.m. and work till 7 p.m. Bob's colleague had kids and refused the shift change. The employer insisted, the colleague quit. That meant that Bob was the only person in the IT department. The employer said they would look to hire a new IT guy, but they had trouble finding one that knew the ERP system, and they were offering well under a market value salary. Bob asked for a raise and was denied. Then he wanted overtime, and the employer told him that as an IT specialist, he was exempt from overtime laws in Ontario. Bob looked it up, and the employer was correct. This went on for some time, and he knew lots of IT people socially. They told him what the company was offering, and Bob knew that they wouldn't find another tech. Things went downhill from there. Bob would get chewed out if he missed a call or an email, no matter what time it came in. He had to train new hires in the ERP system, as well as take care of the hardware. He asked repeatedly for better compensation, and was denied, so he planned to get a new job. Now, here's the revenge. Bob had access to the entirety of the ERP program. When a user signed in, the time was logged, and even if they didn't sign out, after 15 minutes it would log them out anyway. Everyone in the company was on salary, and many of them came in early and stayed late. Ontario labour law states that even salaried workers are entitled to overtime after 44 hours a week, unless they were managers or supervisors. So Bob jumped into the program and ran a report for each employee that wasn't a manager. All the way back to when the ERP program was started. Then he reached out to an employment lawyer and got the okay to refer employees to him. Bob lined up another job, and after he left, every employee in the company got an email with an Excel sheet showing the hours they had put in past 44 hours a week. The subject line said, "You're legally entitled to overtime pay." In the body of the email was the lawyer's name. The shit hit the fan. Almost every employee authorized the lawyer to negotiate with the company on their behalf, and the company had to pay a ton of money. All the company had to do was pay Bob for the extra work he put in. Instead, they had to pay almost everyone. Bob's revenge was effective. The tracking of time using the company's ERP system allowed him to show the injustice he had to bear and helped his colleagues receive what was rightfully theirs by law. Instead of just quitting, Bob planned his exit well, making sure the company had to bear some financial repercussions of their decision to not pay overtime. His approach was brilliant, moral, and timely. It gave the company no other option but to award salaries to the employees they overworked. Justice was sweet. It was poetic, hitting them where it would hurt most, the bottom line. Perfect calculated revenge, if it were really so. The next story is from the Venetia. Landlord screwed with the wrong tenant for too long. This will be decently long as it needs some context. I'm going to throw in a lot of stuff to make it all easier to understand as well. Minor details might not be entirely accurate, as I've no interest in a revival of this conflict on any level. I won completely, and any resurrection can only taint the experience. We'll start off by noting that I spent about 2 decades working in security. During that time, I worked many different types of security in many different locations. The one that matters for this story was time spent in the rental housing tribunal in a major city, as a kind of bailiff. For those not knowing what that is, think a courtroom. In a major city anyway. In a smaller town, it'll probably be an event room in a hotel or community centre, as you'd see on TV, but with less formality and an adjudicator instead of a judge. They functionally are the same thing to landlords and tenants, but they definitely aren't the same thing. This place exclusively deals with landlord and tenant disputes, and is the only place to resolve landlord and tenant disputes. Note that I wasn't a bailiff, and it wasn't a court, but these terms mostly accurately describe the situation and my place in it. For 2 years, I worked at the rental housing tribunal. It was early in my time in security. I was 18 to 20. Being as it was a major city, the sheer number of cases I sat through was beyond my ability to count. I saw everything there was to see. No one is capable of surprising me with a story because I've seen them all. In detail, as a side duty of mine was to ensure all parties had copies of all evidence being presented. I did a lot of photocopying and always read/inspected everything I copied to ensure nothing got cut off or made illegible. By the time I stopped working there, I probably knew the way everything worked well enough to be an adjudicator myself. Well, no, obviously not, but I'm certainly in no need of a lawyer either, should I ever have need to go there. I also had intimate knowledge of how the system worked beyond the actual rules. Like, for example, adjudicators would always give a little leeway to anyone representing themselves over someone who had a lawyer. Or how pissed off adjudicators would get when a party was speaking out of turn. Seriously, do not do that. Skip forward almost a decade. I left the city and am in a fairly large town in the same province. Same tenant laws. I have a few roommates in a decently sized townhouse. We get along well. But there's a problem. Only I can write checks and our paydays don't line up. So I'm the one who pays the rent, and I usually can't do it on the first because roommates don't usually all pay in time. We advise the landlord, we might be a day or two late, but we'll always have it by the third at the latest. They have no problem with it at all. I spoke to them myself. For about a year, this works fine. No complaints from landlord because even if we're often a day or two late, we always pay. We're also fairly quiet and don't damage the property. Nearly model tenants. I do not actually have any idea why, but one day this changed. I suspect a different person in the company started overseeing the region. One day, suddenly, we got a summons to the Rental Housing Tribunal, hereafter to be referred to as RHT, on the 2nd of the month for failure to pay rent. This doesn't actually lead to a case because we paid the same day. But now, we have to pay the application fee the landlord paid in order to serve the summons. I bitched to the neighbour, who was also the superintendent, and eventually heard back that their contact at the company was now demanding first of the month, no exceptions. Well, that really didn't work for us, so we probably had to pay that fee 15 to 20 times over the next 2 years. I could have gone to tribunal over it, but we were technically without a leg to stand on, and I knew it. Maybe if I went enough times, I can ding them for harassment, but I don't have time for that and my roommates don't care. After being split between us all, the fee wasn't enough deterrent to change our behaviour, so we accepted it. If this was the only issue, there wouldn't be much story though. At around the same time, the rent leeway vanished. So did mandatory maintenance. I'm not going to list everything that went wrong and wasn't fixed. You'll get a decent idea at the end. We suffered through it. We were all working too many hours at shit pay to be able to actually do anything about it. We adapted. But after about 2 years, it broke. Everyone but me up and moved out for various reasons within a 4-month period. I'm not going into any details on my roommates at all, because things kinda exploded for a couple different reasons outside of this. No reason to dig any of that up. I had been saving up a while and was able to quit my job without having to immediately get another, so I suddenly had a lot of time. I didn't want to stay and pay the rent by myself or have to find new roommates I could live with, and with my experience in the RHT, I knew I had the landlord by the balls. So I went for them. I stopped paying rent. Annoyingly, I didn't get a summons the first month, but I did the second, so I went, with a meticulously documented plethora of evidence of failure to maintain the property and entering the property without formal notice. I had a copy for the landlord and a copy for the adjudicator. I know from experience that technically you're supposed to give the other party the evidence before the tribunal, but I also knew about that leeway an adjudicator gives to those who represent themselves. So I didn't give the landlord the evidence until our case came up, 100% total ambush. They argued they were ambushed, but the adjudicator just dismissed the case, dressed me down a little, and told me to file my own summons, as I should have done. This was the petty revenge. The landlord and lawyer drove 3 hours to get there for nothing. Worse than nothing. I filed my own summons, and the big day shows up. It's been about 4 months of me not paying rent at this point. I'm prepared to if I lose, but I don't think I'm going to lose. The whole thing could not have gone better. I had 20 to 30 pages of evidence and 20-odd photographs. They had nothing. They had no actual defense for our water heater being out for 6 months, or us not having a fridge for a year, just to mention 2 severe issues. Their entire defense rested on us being late for rent, which actually worked against them once that led to the adjudicator learning how many times we'd paid the application fee, and lies that had no evidence to support them. They even talked over me a few times, and I saw in his eyes the one time I opened my mouth to protest during their turn to speak, but forced myself to shut up with every gram of willpower I had, so only a squeak came out. The adjudicator respected me. He had no respect for the landlord. I had won on every possible front. The only question was how much. It was more than I'd ever seen. I got 9 months of free rent, and the landlord was ordered to have everything fixed before the next month was over, or I'd get more. I gave notice I was leaving at the end of the 8th month and left at the end of the 9th. Because the landlord had never renewed the lease, I didn't have to give him the 3-month notice the lease specified. If you want a figure to put to it, I basically got a $13,000 judgment in my favour, adjusted for inflation and rounded. I also made the landlord and lawyer drive 3 hours, twice, only to lose. The landlord's face was so red at the end I thought he'd have a heart attack. He didn't though. Bye, Mark. Edit to clarify a few things based on questions. And I also want to add for those good landlords out there, I do feel you. My time in the RHT was eye-opening. For every bad landlord, there are 10 bad tenants easily. There's a massive debate of debates to have over the whole thing. I'll only say that I do sympathise with the good landlords out there. I'm not trying to paint all landlords as terrible. This is the only landlord I've ever had that was so useless. Edit. I've revised my estimate of the ratio based on a little research and some comments from 30 tenants per landlord to 10. I'm probably still wrong, but the sheer number disparity between landlords and tenants effectively requires there be more bad tenants than bad landlords simply because there are so many more tenants than landlords. I'm going to leave it at that and just beg you not to rip me apart from either side. I'm intimately aware of the problems both good landlords and good tenants face, and my sympathy goes out to both sides. Wow, the revenge was perfect. The experience and patience of the OP paid off, and the terrible behaviour of the landlord finally forced him to pay $13,000, not to mention the embarrassment he faced in the end. Almost all landlords are the same. Terrible, meticulous and selfish, always trying to squeeze every last penny out of their tenants. Bye-bye for today. Let's see you tomorrow.